I have recently returned from a 3-week long trip to Asia. It was a long delayed journey that I've been postponing for years until I could have enough time to justify the long trip there and back to stay long enough to make it make sense. I thought I timed the trip pretty well, actually, but I had not factored in considerations for the monsoon season in Southeast Asia. We've all heard of monsoons, but if you've never been in one, it is difficult to describe. The rain was coming from the direction of Vietnam that was experiencing a hurricane, so the best description I know is actually in the movie Forrest Gump when he was serving in Vietnam, where he says, "One day it started to rain, and it didn't quit for 4 months. We've been through every kind of rain there is. Little bitty stinging rain, big old fat rain, rain that flew in sideways, and sometimes rain even seemed to come straight up from underneath. Shoot, it even rained at night." I had a good trip. I saw a lot. I learned a lot. But what I saw more of than anything else was the inside of a hotel room where the only English channel was the Asian news in English, and they talked incessantly about the record-setting rain and flooding right where I happened to be. I didn't have a computer. I hadn't even taken a book. I didn't have access to any programs in English other than the news, so I had a lot of time to think. Now that I'm in this transition from my more than 40-year-long career as a parish pastor through this period of time of being part-time and evolving towards being a fully retired and genuinely annoying retired pastor, I spend a lot of time thinking about these decades that I have spent in church. As with many other professions, there are certainly high points, but there have been low spots. There were successes and accolades and awards that I did not deserve. And there were heartbreaks and disappointments, which mostly I'm convinced I also did not deserve. Captured by torrential rain and flooded streets in a small apartment in Phuket, Thailand, I can say that I have been haunted by ghosts. The memories of friendships that had failed, relationships with people I had once thought would last a lifetime, with people that were closer to me than blood kin, and more vital even than the influence of parents and siblings, but which almost always, with an element of shock and disbelief, came to an inexplicable end. I don't say that to get sympathy, because I know that everyone who's managed to live beyond middle school has experienced the heartbreak of losing a close friendship. But I am speaking today about friendship from my own perspective. And in my life as a minister, friendship has taken on some unique twists and turns. Also, all the time I had alone in the monsoon in Asia, it was, after all, my ghosts that were haunting me, not yours. I just hope that some of my stories are familiar touchstones for you. My reflections included a lot of time going back to the decision I made when I was just 21 years old, when I was weighing the choice between going to law school or going to seminary. Back then, I had a lot of explanations for why I chose to be a minister, God's call, a greater good. But I realize now that primarily I made that choice because I wanted to be loved. I've always believed that I had one of the less miserable childhoods of almost anyone I've known. I wasn't molested, and while my parents were not afraid of using corporal punishment, it wasn't frequent and was almost never very severe. But it is true that in the 1940s, my parents had 2 children that they meant to have and were happy to have, and that they were convinced would comprise their entire family. In the 1950s, they had 2 more sons, which they distinctly and obviously did not mean to have, and that they did not want. I was the second of those 2 mishaps. Unlike so many of the people who have scheduled appointments to come talk to me through the years, My home was stable. There was no fighting. There were no loud arguments. There was never a mention of divorce. There was no drinking or substance abuse. And we all wore clean clothes. We ate 3 meals a day. We were driven to school. They took us to the doctor when we were sick. And most of the people that I've had reason to have come to me for counseling through the years to talk about their family of origin, they couldn't say any of those things about the family that they grew up in. But what was missing in my family home, at least from my end of the birth order, was any sign of affection or approval or acceptance or anything that might have even passed for love or joy. It wasn't a dysfunctional family. In fact, it was a family that was really good at functioning. We had our assigned duties in the house, in the lawn, and it was all kept with a certain military precision. The saving grace for me in that sterile environment was the fact that my family went to church. My mother even was the church secretary, so I walked to church every day after school, and we were there for every Sunday morning and Sunday night and Wednesday night service they ever dreamed of having. So being in church 6 days a week has not just been my career, it was my childhood. Church had a lot more dimensions to it than my home did. The organist was an alcoholic. The choir director was a high school teacher with a taste for adolescent boys. There was a deacon who owned the drive-in theater that showed X-rated films visible from just the right hilltop on Highway 31. There was, for a time, also the governor of Kentucky in that church, a few less honorable politicians, and a few well-known criminals, and no small amount of philandering. I wasn't aware of all that when I was young, but with each new revelation, church continued to be much more interesting than anything else that was going on in my rural Kentucky life. Church was where we talked about important things. It was where we read books. We even, to a certain degree, experienced the arts. And it was in church that I heard that the war in Vietnam was not just. It was in church that I heard a demand for the integration of public schools, for decent working conditions and pay in our local factories, and even an absolute rejection of capital punishment. Brother Duncan, our pastor, was a powerful, tall, lean man, a white-haired preacher, and as a child, it seemed to me as if he spoke with the confidence as if God was whispering in his ear every time he stepped into the pulpit. As it turned out, though, it wasn't always God that he was in conversation with. When Brother Duncan didn't get satisfaction from the managers at our local sewing factory, Sorensen's, he also called in his brother, who happened to be a labor union organizer. And in that little town, Brother Duncan and his brother succeeded in unionizing the largest employer in southern Kentucky, a nearly impossible, though courageous, accomplishment. But it was still southern Kentucky in the 1960s, so the church fired Brother Duncan, and he got revenge by promptly dying of a heart attack. But not before he had planted a seed in my consciousness. The church, the town, my own parents had turned on him. But I knew something they didn't know. I knew that Brother Duncan was right. I didn't know how to get the love I craved, but I had a role model of how to be a prophet. The church was always more of a family to me than my family was. They could be messy and cruel, but there was love there, and there was honest debate, and as a young preacher, I was certainly challenged and criticized, but I was also nurtured. I was encouraged and loved, and those things were things I never got at home. I was only 23 years old when I started writing opinion pieces for the local newspaper, taking on an obviously corrupt city government that was protecting the institution of bootlegging, which also funded prostitution and drug sales, all rooted in the black neighborhood of Russellville, Kentucky. I succeeded in putting them out of business. and getting that rural community to vote in legal liquor sales, which closed the bootleggers, added taxes to the sale of alcohol, and it shut off the funding to the related industries of prostitution and drug sales. It also increased the tax base of the city enough to increase the size of the police force, and though I didn't get fired, it did start my long history of getting death threats and suffering humiliating attacks in the press. But I was probably the only 23-year-old preacher in southern Kentucky that had police protection every time I went to the pulpit, which is not at all relevant to this story. I had experienced an intensity of friendship in my college campus ministry. We had endless conversations, warm hugs, there was compassion, there was empathy, there was opportunity to serve. Even more importantly, opportunities to make mistakes and to be forgiven and to grow and mature. It was easy in that environment to fall in love, easy to get married, as many of us did, far too young, because that was a context in which we had found meaning and purpose for life, even if we had very little appreciation for how brief that whole college experience turns out to be. In grad school, I became aware of how I had been shaped by the emotional vacuum of my home, how I longed to turn my congregation into more than a mere faith community. I wanted it to be a loving family. I wanted friendships that became fraternal, lifelong, loving, and joyful. Cicero said more than 2,000 years ago that real friendship was impossible except among truly good people. And as soon as he said that, he started to backpedal, acknowledging that you couldn't expect good people to be perfect people. He never really cleared it up, though he talked about it a lot, but I came away with a sense that what he meant is that friendship is only possible among goodish people. What I became aware of over and over again is that absolutely everyone is broken. There's hardly a person who's old enough to leave the backyard and keep walking until the clothesline was no longer in sight who did not have some exposed nerves. It's a lot easier, though, for church members to make friendships among themselves and to keep them because church members don't always know what everybody else thinks, whereas the minister is always holding the talking stick. As my ex-wife liked to say, you have no unpublished thoughts. Some of my professors at Vanderbilt would occasionally say in the midst of a lecture, now, you preachers can't say this in your churches, but, and I would start taking notes furiously because whatever I was not supposed to reveal from the pulpit would be my next Sunday's sermon. I think that the academics in schools like Vanderbilt assume that church folk really are more like sheep than they are like thinking people. They assume that the church people couldn't stand too much truth, too much insight. But I wanted to end the centuries of teaching successive generations myths that did not serve their real lives. I wanted to expose the lies and reveal the naked truth. However, that impulse was in direct conflict with what I wanted the most, which was I wanted my congregation's love and friendship. I wanted it more than a drowning person wants to breathe. But I never made it easy for people to be my friend. It took me getting fired at the age of 50 to realize that you can get a congregation's respect without getting their love, and that virtually no church will love any minister who is not first and foremost a moderate, who does not hold strong opinions about anything of current importance. You add to the controversy that comes with trying to be a prophetic preacher the secrets you learn when you are the parish pastor. I almost never had a church member who managed to stay in a friendship with me when I had been called into their most embarrassing life moments. Sometimes I had to go break up domestic disputes. I wrestled a pistol out of one of my best friend's hands when I walked in on a drunken family fight. She had shot at her out-of-control husband and missed him, thankfully, but the bullet had gone through the wall into the nursery and had literally pierced the bedclothes in the crib over their sleeping baby. We had been so close, but as has happened hundreds of times in the 40 years since that day, when you bail someone out of jail or you have someone arrested, when you know about the affairs, the crimes, the addictions, most people don't have what it takes to face their shadows and still be friends with the people who have seen them in their worst moments. Real friendship can only take place among good people. Not perfect people, but at least goodish people. People who have the character to be known for both their good attributes and their brokenness, and to still love the people who have seen both sides of who they really are. These are the ghosts that visited me when the streets of Phuket were 3 feet deep in floodwaters, and I had a few days of isolation to remember where all the scars on my heart have come from. And I still feel grief about every friendship that ended that might have been saved if we'd been smart enough, if we'd been disciplined enough, if we'd been good enough to rise above the pain of conflict or humiliation. I've already talked too long to give the friendship of Jesus and Judas the time and energy it deserves, so I'm going to distill it down to a nutshell right now. Judas was not a real person. Judas is a literary invention, what we call an interlocular. Judas isn't just one person, but the gospel writer, Mark, we call Mark, invented him as a literary representative of a lot of people. It's no accident that Judas sounds like Judah. Mark distilled all the betrayal, all of the falsehood, all of the pain and broken relationships that led up to the crucifixion of Jesus and put it into one character in a brilliantly described passion narrative. But if it makes you mad to hear me say that Judas wasn't a real person, so matter-of-factly, write to me and ask me to prove it to you, and maybe I'll do a sermon about that in April when Easter comes around. We don't have a lot of historical evidence to go on, but my best assumptions about the actual death of Jesus of Nazareth is that he was crucified by the Roman government, along with a few other Jewish troublemakers, under a charge of insurrection following a riot he started in the outer court of the temple. This probably happened during the Jewish harvest festival, Sukkot, in the fall, but so far as we know, the first gospel writer, Mark, takes tremendous liberties with history in order to write a sermon, a passion narrative, that in spite of his bad grammar, gives us one of the most brilliant narratives in all of literature. Mark is, on one level, trying to answer one of the first and biggest problems with the Christian story. If Jesus was God's chosen one, how did he get killed? And the answer couldn't be simply that the powerful Roman government plucked him out of a band of rioters and executed him. Mark tells the story of the death of Jesus as an archetypal narrative of betrayal, symbolically at least, a betrayal by everyone, his family, his closest disciples, all of his Judean people. But Mark pulls it down into just a few characters: a governor, a high priest, his friend Peter, but mostly it was the interlocular, the symbolic character of Judas. Judas was portrayed as the most trusted friend. Judas carried the money bag for the group. You know, you don't give the money to someone that you don't trust. He was the one trusted with everything they had. He is said to have always been seated next to Jesus at every meal. In fact, he was the kind of friend who could walk up to Jesus in a crowd and publicly just walk up and give him a kiss. It was that person, that beloved friend, who could bring about the death of God's very own. William Shakespeare is obviously borrowing from Mark's passion narrative in the way that he described the death of Julius Caesar. We do know from history that Caesar was stabbed by a group of senators who were, in part, organized by Marcus Brutus. But Shakespeare makes it so personal. He describes Caesar being surrounded by his assassins, and one by one they stab him, and Caesar turns to see with each blow who is holding the dagger. Finally, he is stabbed by Brutus, and Shakespeare says that Caesar looked at his friend and said, "Et tu, Brute, then die, Caesar." You too. If it's you, if it's Brutus, then I can't possibly live. Suggesting, of course, that the mighty Roman dictator might have survived if it had been anyone but Brutus who stabbed him. Medically speaking, it is likely to die from being stabbed more than 20 times, which Caesar was, but that is irrelevant. Biological observations are not needed when you are feeling the sting of the betrayal of a friend, when your heart is broken by the loss of a close friendship. It feels like you've been stabbed in the heart, doesn't it? Cicero was critical of the sophists of his day who warned people to avoid making close friends. He seems to suggest that you should be friendly with some people who are useful to you, that can benefit you in some way, but you should avoid actually loving someone because that kind of friendship will almost inevitably hurt you. Love is dangerous. That way, Cicero really didn't disagree with the sophists because you place yourself at risk when you love someone. Still, he concludes, you should try. If only we could figure out who is really good, or at least goodish. I'm a fairly clever boy with more than a little training in psychology, and I've been wrong 100 times more often than I've been right. Admittedly, the unique nature of my work and undoubtedly the way I've gone about my work makes it hard to be a good friend to me for long. But still, I still think that love is worth the risk. If you don't want to be a sophist in the way that Cicero describes them, you can't just use people and then discard them when they are no longer useful or when the friendship asks a little too much of you. But I bet that both Freud and Nostradamus had less than a 500 batting average when it came to picking the right people who were actually capable of sustaining a meaningful friendship. Now, I've taken 30 minutes of your time to get to this point. Friendships can be, and most often are, dangerous, or at least disappointing. The worst ones can actually kill you, and at best, most of them will disappoint you. And yet they are still worth the risk and possibly even necessary to life, and they are necessary to the success of families, of corporations, of churches, of armies, and I think of nations. But no one can consistently tell in advance who has the character to hold up their end of the bargain. Still, there is one important thing that you can do. You can be good enough to be worthy of friendship. You can choose to never stab a friend in the back, never betray with a kiss. You can choose to never abandon a friend in their darkest hour. And I would like to add even this. Do not assume that friendships are in an endless supply. Don't lose a friend through neglect, absence, forgetfulness, or by taking them for granted. My very own Ides of March actually took place in July of 2007 when I was fired from my church position in a coup that was, in large part, organized by false friends. I withdrew hard. For a time, I cut myself off from everyone. I remember even saying to my daughter that I hoped that I would never be dumb enough again to trust anybody. Slowly, I recovered enough to try again, but admittedly not without a lot of caution and no small amount of what Cicero would have surely called sophistry. I gave almost all of my energy to starting our progressive church and rarely had a minute for anyone that was not a part of that project. I starved a lot of old friendships through neglect while being so focused on creating a church that would survive. It's only been in this past year, as I've begun to step back from full-time ministry, that I've made space in my life to just be a friend to some people who couldn't care less about what I do in my professional life. I've been able to resume some vital relationships with people I was once close to, but who I simply didn't bother to be in contact with for 15 years. In one case, it started just by playing racquetball, and in a very few weeks, we were both kicking ourselves for having let so many years pass without contact. We have become again what we once were to each other years ago, the closest confidant I have and the most of trusted friends. There have been so many times in those 15 years when I have felt so isolated, so all alone in the world, when I really didn't need to. So not all of the ghosts that have haunted me recently were scary. Some of them, given a little time and effort, turned out to be saints. People now, in this messed up time in history, have fewer friends, less contact with family. We have more addiction, more depression, and frankly, a lot more suicide. I don't have the answers for a world that seems to be falling apart, but I have one answer that I know makes a big difference. Be a friend. Treasure your friends. Invest time and energy in your friendships. Give up your anger. Set your resentments aside. Please stop fantasizing about revenge and focus on being a good person who is worthy of trust and friendship. And if you can do that, you can be part of the healing of a fractured world. Now, some of you are going to have to start by just trying to be goodish, but please do your best.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.